Good afternoon, everyone. Many years ago, I was intrigued by a verse in the Old Testament. It was in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 9. If you'd like to turn there, we can just read that verse, Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 9. And this is describing the promised land into which God was going to bring Israel. And in verse 9 of Deuteronomy chapter 8 we read, "A land wherein you shall eat bread without scarceness, you shall not lack anything in it. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you may dig brass." Now that kind of intrigued me, because I thought, well, brass is an alloy, isn't it? Now, how can they dig brass out of the hills? So is that a mistranslation? Well, in fact, brass is mentioned many times in the King James Bible. The first occurrence is in Genesis chapter 4. There's no need to turn there, but you may recall that there was a lady called Zillah who bore Tubal-Cain, and he was described as an instructor of every artificer or craftsman in brass and also iron. And then we find in Exodus 25, when God's giving the directions for the building of the tabernacle, brass is mentioned many times. For example, the Israelites were asked to give an offering to help build the tabernacle, to provide the materials for it. And when they took up the offering, they took up gold, silver and brass. And then we find the description of the tabernacle. It was held together apparently with brass taches or clasps or fasteners made of brass, as mentioned in the King James. They also made pillars of brass, and the pillars were mounted into sockets, which were also made of brass. And then there was the altar on which they made burnt offerings. They were directed to build that out of acacia wood, but then to cover it in brass, to overlay it with brass, because it would get pretty hot, and obviously the wood would just burn otherwise. And we find that there are many other things mentioned in connection with the tabernacle. Various vessels made of brass, and we mentioned the pillars and the sockets. Now, in all of these cases, King James Bible mentions brass, but in almost all other translations it's translated bronze. So is that a mistranslation in the King James? Well, let's continue with a few more examples. You remember the story of when the Israelites murmured against Moses, and God sent fiery serpents among them. That story you can find in Numbers 21. No need to turn there now, but if you want to make a note, Numbers 21. And because they murmured, God sent fiery serpents amongst them, and the serpents bit some of them to death. And when they finally repented, God directed Moses to build a serpent and to put it up on a pole. And it says that Moses made a serpent of brass and put it on a pole. And as we find later on in the New Testament, there's an allusion to that being representation of Jesus Christ. You'll find that in John 3:14, just before, a couple of verses before the very famous John 3:16, God so loved the world. And there in John 3:14 it just says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." And he goes on to say, so that all who believe in him might not perish, and so on. Then, of course, there are metaphorical expressions like Deuteronomy 28 will mention in times of famine that the sky will be as brass. And, of course, brass is a yellowy metal, so that kind of makes sense in King James. But in almost all other translations, it's translated brass. Bronze. Well, let's find a few more examples. You all know the story of David and Goliath. And Goliath, as he was challenging Israel, he had this massive brass helmet on and a brass spear. He was going to thrust the spear at David to get rid of him, but David, of course, defeated him. But before David faced Goliath, Saul tried to put his own helmet on David, which was made of brass. And David didn't find that at all comfortable, so he took it off and didn't have any armour at all. You'll also find brass mentioned in the building of the temple, Solomon's temple, many, many times. And then, of course, we have the image in Daniel's prophecy. The image, head of gold, breast and arms of silver, and belly and thighs of brass. Now, in all of these examples, there's one Hebrew word used, which is spelt Nehoshet. It looks like Nehoshet, but it's pronounced Nekosheth. Nekosheth. And the word in Daniel is slightly different because it's derived from the Aramaic, from the Chaldean language of the time. So it's very slightly different. But the question is, should it be brass or bronze? Is that an error in the King James? Because brass and bronze, for any of you who know about your alloys, are quite different. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, primarily. Do add a few other metals sometimes and different proportions of zinc to get different hardnesses. And bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. And again, sometimes other metals and non-metals are added to change the properties of the alloy. But they're quite different and they have different colour and different properties. Well, actually, if you look into history, you'll find that bronze, which is, as I say, is an alloy of copper and tin, was used extensively in biblical times. But it wasn't called bronze. In fact, the word bronze didn't appear into the English language until the 18th century. So in the days when the King James Bible was translated, there was no such word as bronze. And it was introduced into the English language to distinguish it from brass and copper and other metals. Now, the word bronze actually comes from the Italian bronzo, and it was translated into French, where it looks just like the English word bronze, bronze, probably rhymes with 11, onze. And it wasn't long after the King James Bible was produced that there was no other word to describe it. And in the Hebrew, there's just this one word, which is used for copper and any alloys of copper, Nekosheth. And if you bear in mind that there were some 47 scholars involved in the translation of the King James Bible, and they were appointed by the King James, and it took them over 7 years to translate the King James Bible, so they were very, very careful in the words that they chose. Now, one other occurrence of brass that we might like to look at is found in the New Testament, a description of Jesus Christ in Revelation chapter 1. You're familiar with that, I'm sure, because it says in Revelation 1 verse 14, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. Now here you find, again, in other translations, it's bronze. But it doesn't really make much difference here, because the description is of brass as if it burned in a furnace, so the brass would be white hot, and it would be really bright. Of course, when metals get white hot, you don't see their natural colour, you just see the whiteness of the heat. And so, it is not a mistranslation in King James, it's simply that in those days, the word brass, which is from Old English brise, spelled B-R-A-E together, S. A-E used to be a letter of the alphabet in Roman English, Latin English, and that letter was called ash. I never knew that until I found that out recently. But the actual origin of that word is quite unknown. It's probably linked to the word brazen, but it was used to mean any alloys of copper and any alloys. And in the Hebrew there's just the one word, which is copper or alloys of copper. Now if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 9, it still needs explaining, because how could they dig brass out of the hills? Even if it's bronze, how could they dig bronze out of the hills? Well, the answer is this, that in order to obtain any metal out of the hills, you had to smelt the material. You had to heat it up to a high temperature and the metals would liquefy. But in those days, it was very difficult to get pure copper. There were often lots of traces of zinc in with the rocks, and so what you'd end up with is an impure form of copper, and it would have zinc with it, and so it would actually be a type of brass. So that could well be an accurate description that they got brass out of the hills. And in fact, brass was not really understood until much later than when the word bronze was introduced. The alloys that you get from combining copper and zinc to produce brass were just not fully understood until something like the 18th century, or later than that even. But, so just to conclude, there was no mistranslation in King James. They were using the only word that was available in their time, and it's an accurate translation. And there are some very interesting analogies of the properties of bronze, which of course the reason why most modern translations have translated it into bronze is because they believe that that was more likely to be the alloy that was being produced in biblical times, simply because they didn't understand much about brass, the alloy with zinc. Certainly they mined tin and combined copper and tin to form alloys. They did that in ancient Egypt, and it was introduced into Israel. So I'll leave you with that thought, and also there is much more one could say about the properties and how they signify characteristics of Jesus Christ, but that's another story for another time.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. That's very interesting. We're now going to have two more hymns in this section, and then after that we'll have the announcements from Mr. Len Mailing, and then after that the sermon from Barry Robinson. So we'll sing two more hymns. If you'd like to take your hymn books, we'll sing 120 first, number 120. So if you'd like to stand and take your, and we'll sing 120. Count your blessings.